So the agenda is we are going to cover in today what are the modules which are there in the CGRC, what can be the target audience and what are the sample questions. So now when we are talking about CGRC, okay, certified governance, risk and compliance, it is basically a certification which is provided by ISC Square, okay, which validates the advanced knowledge skills where you are integrating governance, risk management, privacy and compliance. Now many people who come for the CGRC training, they normally have a common question like, what's the difference between the CGRC which is provided by ISC Square comparative to your ISACA. In ISACA, we also have a C risk, right? So when we are talking about your CGRC, in C, the basic difference, okay, between CGRC and the C risk is CGRC is more focused on implementing and managing the governance, risk and compliance, which is mainly deals with frameworks such as your NIST, SP 800-37, 800-53 and CSF. Whereas when we talk about from ISACA perspective, ISACA C-risk is mainly deals with the enterprise risk management and control frameworks from a business risk perspective. So that is the difference. So basically your CGRC is ideal for those people who are working in the risk management framework, such as if you are working for, if you are already doing an ISO 27001, if you are if you are already working on ISO 27001 as a lead auditor, lead implementer, okay, and you want to get a broader overview of what exactly is there in the NIST SP 800-37 and 53, then for that purpose the CGRC, for those kind of people, CGRC is mainly CGRC is more suited for security professionals who are already working on the risk management framework. Whereas when I am talking about in terms of C risk, in C risk we have IT and business professionals who are involved in more risk identification, assessment and mitigation within corporate or IT context. So basically, if I have to cover in detail the difference between the CGRC and CRISC, CGRC contains around 7 domains, whereas your C-risk contains only 4 domains. So if you, the CGRC is more technical in depth because it basically talks about all the risk management framework. So what happens in each stage of the risk management framework, right? So now when we are talking about this exam is based on 7 domains, which is your security and privacy, governance, scope of the system, selection and approval of controls, implementation, assessment, audit, system compliance and compliance maintenance. Now, so like any ISC Square examination, this examination is definitely not a CAT based exam. So basically you have 3 hours and you have 125 questions which you have to solve within 3 hours. There is no option to go back, there is no mark for review, okay. And once you clear the examination, so basically what is the passing criteria? The passing criteria is you have to score minimum 70% in all the 7 domains, okay. So let's say you manage to score 60% in you manage to score 70% in 6 domains, and in the last domain you only were able to score 65%. So will we be able to pass the examination? The answer is no. You need to score 70% in all the exam, in all the topics, the 7 domains which are testable in the exam. Now once you clear the CGRC, it is like you have cleared the exam, you have provisionally passed the exam. So what it means is that after clearing the exam is one part of the story, and uh, proving the clearing the exam is one part of the story. The second part of the story is where you have to prove your work experience. So you need minimum 2 years of work experience in any of in one or more of these domains to be fully certified. So at least you should, so whatever the 7 domains which we will cover in the CGRC, out of that minimum in 2 or 3 domains you should have at least 2 years of work experience. Otherwise you will be considered as an associate of ISC square, where after once you get the associate certification, you have the you have the ISC square will give you the time to earn the experience, and later on you have to submit the endorsement. Now one thing which you have to understand is, when you are clearing the exam, the second part of the process comes where you have to do the endorsement process. Now when we say in the endorsement process, when you say that I have 2 years of work experience in out of 7 in any of the 2 domains out of 7, how you are going to validate this work experience? So you basically need experience letter from your current or previous organization. You basically need roles and responsibilities letter. You basically need your salary slips. Okay, all these documents must be uploaded in the portal when you are submitting the endorsement. Okay, along with that you have to also how to put it, you have to also mention your current manager's email address and your previous your ex manager's email address. So if before you have a before you mention their email address or contact details, it is advisable that you have a word with them, that whether they are willing to testify your work experience. Okay, and once you have done all this, then finally you will be, it will take around minimum 3 to 6 weeks for ISC square to validate all these documents, and finally you will be recognized as a certified governance, risk and compliance. Okay, now it when it comes to the like any other ISC square certifications, even your CGRC has minimum CPE requirements. Okay, so now when we are talking about from the exam perspective, your CGRC, just a second team. So the CGRC, what is the CPE points which you need for in terms of your CGRC? So for the CGRC minimum you need 20 CPE points. So sorry, you must maintain 60 CPE points which you have to collect over the period of 3 years. So what you can do is, probably on the first year you collect 20, the second year you collect 20, and on the third year you collect 20. So minimum 60 CPE points is needed, because by default the certification is only valid for 3 years. After that, if you want to extend the certification, you have to meet the CPE requirements criteria. So now, what are the modules which are covered in the CGRC? The first is, we have your information security and risk management program. So in this, what we cover, we basically cover the governance principles, policies, standard procedures, risk management concepts, risk appetite, risk tolerance, residual risk, roles and responsibilities of CISO, CIO, information security officer, authorizing official. We talk about the legal and regulatory requirements, like in terms of GDPR, PCI DSS, California Consumer Protection Act, SOC, GLBA. What is the security and privacy program management and integration of risk management with the business strategy. So now let me just bring up the exam outline of the CGRC so that we can go in more depth. Just give me a minute. So the entire CGRC is basically focused on the NIST SP 800-37. So the entire exam. So if you are planning to prepare for the CGRC, okay, now these are the weightage. As you can see, security, privacy, governance, and risk management and compliance program. It has a 16% weightage. Then we have the scope of the system, which has 10. Select and approval the framework, security, and privacy controls, which has a 14% weightage. Implementation of security and privacy controls has a 17% weightage, and assessment, audit, and security and privacy controls is 16. So basically you are going to get more questions on domain 1, on domain 4, and domain 5. Okay, so now if I am talking about in the domain 1, what exactly we are going to cover in the domain 1, as I have mentioned, we are going to cover the risk management and compliance framework. Now when I say the risk management framework, this is where we are going to cover the NIST CSF 2.0 framework. So the people who are planning for CGRC, I recommend that those people should have an in-depth knowledge of ISO 27001, specifically the Annexure A controls, right? So they must have a strong knowledge on the ISO 27001, like what are the controls in terms of annexure, which is there. The second is you must have an in-depth knowledge on the CSF 2.0, the NIST CSF 2.0, because unless and until you have an in-depth knowledge of the NIST CSF 2.0, whatever things you are planning to, whatever things you are seeing in the SP 800-37, it will be bouncer. So the first which we will cover is we will cover the risk management and compliance framework as per the NIST. So where we will cover the CSF 2.0. Then we will start with the SP 800-37. We will discuss the COBIT. We will basically discuss the ISO. We will discuss about the NIST system development life cycle, where requirement gathering, design, development, testing. We will talk about that information life cycle. So now when we are talking about the information life cycle, so we have something called as a CSU SAD. So if you which we are talking about NIST data life cycle, right? So we have like create, store, use, archive, share, destroy. All these data lifecycle model is going to discussed over here. Then we are going to talk about the CIA on non-repudiation and privacy concepts, system assets and boundary description, security and privacy controls, and what is the role and responsibilities for the compliance activities and associated frameworks. Then in the 1.2, establishing how we can establish the compliance program. Okay, what kind of frameworks we are going to use, how to deal with the legal and regulatory concerns and requirements. Here we are going to discuss in more detail the ISO 27001, FedRAM, PCI DSS merchant levels, the PCI DSS 12 controls, cybersecurity maturity model certification, FedRAM, FISMA, HIPAA, GDPR. All these are testable in the domain 1. Okay, now when we talk about in the domain 2, okay, now when we talk about in the domain 2, just a second. So in domain 2 is more talking about the scope of the information system. So where we are talking about how we are going to categorize the system based on confidentiality, integrity, and availability, how to define the system boundaries and interconnections, what kind of data types the system is going to process, how the data is going to flow. We are going to work on having an asset inventory and classifying, and finally documenting the system components and the environment of operation. So now when we are talking about in the domain 2 scope of the system, so again in this we are going to identify what are the security objectives for each information type based on national, international security and privacy compliance requirements. So let's say if we have identified a data as top secret, then what are the baselines, what are the controls which we need to implement to protect the data, right? Let's say if you are talking about cryptography, so what kind of cryptography algorithms are suggested by NIST? So whether we are going to use the FIPS 140-2, whether FIPS 140-3, then we are going to discuss the data protection impact assessment and the risk impact level determined for the system based on the selected framework. So now let me do one thing. Let me bring the the document. Just a second. So the entire CGRC is going to be based on this document. Until and unless you know what happens in each stage, you cannot clear the examination. So the entire exam is going to be based on this one single document. Okay, so in this, like if we are talking about your in terms of your CGRC, so as you can see, the first step, just a second. So as you can see here, the entire exam is going to be based on the fundamentals, which is how you can conduct the organization wide risk management, the framework, steps and structures, information security and privacy in the RMF, system and system elements, what are the system and what are the elements of the system, how we are going to define the authorization boundaries, then the risk management. Now based on this, the entire examination is going to be based on chapter 2 and chapter 3, the process. So what exactly happens in prepare, categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize and monitor. Okay, a huge amount of there you are going to get huge amount of questions even on the roles and responsibilities. So what is the what is the role and responsibility of a common control provider, chief risk officer, okay, security architect. So the more you will get a good amount of questions on the roles and responsibilities sections as well. So like what is the role and responsibility of the CRO, CIO, CTO, okay, common control provider, all this. So the entire examination is going to be based on this document, NIST SP 800-37. So now in the domain 2, as I have mentioned, these are the things which we are going to discuss. Now when we talk about the domain 3 here, so in the previous step, what we did in the previous step, we categorized, right, where we identified, we categorized the system based on the CIA. We identified what are the boundaries and how the system is linked or interconnected with other systems, what are the data types the system is processing, how the data is going to flow, check that whether we have a complete asset inventory and classification, and finally we are going to document the system components and the environment of operation. So here you are defining the scope of the system. Now in the third stage, which is the selection and approval of security and privacy controls as per the NIST RMF framework, this is where we are going to select the controls. So now when I say that this is where we are going to select the controls, here we are going to select the controls, the type of controls which we are going to implement. Okay, so the controls, so for which document we are going to use. So NIST SP 800-37 is your risk management. It is a risk management document, but the control selection will be happening from NIST SP 800-53 or ISO 27001 Annexure A. Now this is where things get more interesting when we go into the ISE square, because when we say, when you reach the selection and approval of security and privacy controls, the controls are selected from NIST SP 800-53. Okay, however in the exam you have to read the question carefully, that whether it is asking you to select the controls from the NIST SP 800-53 or from ISO 27001 Annexure A, because in the exam there is a probability that things will come from both the places. The things will come from both the places. Okay, so in the choosing and tailoring controls, we selected the controls either from the NIST SP 800-53 or ISO 27001. Then finally, we are not going to choose the controls as it is. We are going to tailor the controls which can according to our business requirement or business scenario, right? We will select like what are the privacy controls we need. Finally, we will develop the security privacy plans, and we will obtain the approval from the authorization or AO, authorizing official or governing body. Here the controls will be implemented or not. Selection and approval of implementing the controls will always be done by the AO. So if you remember, when I was showing you the document, the NIST SP 800-37, I was showing, right? There is a huge amount of question which you are going to get from, you know, the roles and responsibilities. So majorly the examination is going to test you the you will get a good amount of questions, at least 10 to 15 questions you will get based on roles and responsibilities like authorizing official, common control provider, CRO, CTO, all these kind of questions. It will come like who is responsible for, you know, selecting and approving the controls. This kind of questions will come in the examination. So obtaining approval from the authorizing official or governing body. Now if you see in the domain 3, selection and approval of security and privacy controls. So these are, so what all things it is included: determining the applicable baseline and what are the controls which are inherited, then determining the appropriate control which we need to enhance in terms of security practices, overlays and mitigating controls, specify what are the data handling marking requirements, select the control, document it, have a continuous monitoring process in place to check that whether the control is effective, have a vulnerability management process and allocate the control, and make sure before you allocate any kind of controls the stakeholder agrees whatever control has been selected. So now moving on to the domain 4. In the domain 4, this is where we are going to implement the security and privacy controls. So whatever in the previous stage, whatever controls we selected, in this stage we are going to implement the controls. So the focus is putting the selected controls into action. So the what is the NIST RMF step over here? Implement. So here we are going to implement the controls which we have selected. So we are going to determine the implementation procedures. How can we gather the evidence that the control is successfully implemented? We are going to have a configuration management and change control. We are going to, if we are designing a software, we are going to follow the security engineering principles such as least privilege, defense in depth. And finally, we are going to maintain detailed documentation of each and every control which is going to be used for conducting audits and assessment. So as you can see over here, so the first is develop the implementation strategy such as resource funding, timeline and effectiveness, where we are going to implement a control which is aligned with our organizational expectations. It can be my national or international requirements. We will identify the control types, whether it is going to be a management control, technical, common or operational control. So live example of a management control, I can say like your background verification. Technical control can be your firewall. Common control can be an identity and access management. So what are the control types we have, which we are going to identify the control types. Determine the frequency for compliance documentation, reviews and training, like how frequently we are going to check that whether the control which we have implemented, whether it is meeting our legal and regulatory requirements. We are going to determine the frequency. We are going to implement the controls. Control implementation, make sure that the control which you are implementing, it is consistent with the compliance requirement. Compensate or alternate security, make sure the compensating or alternate security controls are implemented. In terms of documenting the control implementation, once the controls is implemented, so live example, is it possible to mitigate all the risk which we have identified? Team, tell me, is it possible? The answer is no. So whatever controls you have implemented, there will be some residual risk which will be left, right? So if that residual risk is below the risk appetite level of the organization, what we can do, we can actually accept that risk. But if it is exceeding the risk appetite level of the organization, what we have to do, we have to develop the plan of action and milestones. We have to determine, we need to have a contingency plan, how we are going to address those residual risks which are still above the risk appetite level of the organization, right? And finally, we are going to implement the controls, document it, and make sure that it suits our organization's purpose, scope, and risk profile. So that's what is there in the domain 4. So in the domain 5, which is your assessment and audit of security and privacy controls. Now, what do you mean by assessment? So now we have implemented the controls, right? We have implemented the controls. Now we have to assess the controls. Like we have to assess the controls, that whether the controls which we have implemented, whether it is relevant, whether it is meeting my business requirements or not. So in the assess stage, we are going to determine the assessment method. Are we going to examine, are we going to interview the people, or we are going to test? So now when I am talking about examine, okay team, here examine means I am just observing how the control is implemented. So where I am observing, I am examining, means I am observing the documentations, right? I am observing the change management plan, I am observing the internal audit report, right? I am observing the security control assessment report. So I am examining how the control is implemented, I am reviewing the documents. Okay, now when I say interview means I am going to interview the people who has implemented this control. So live example, let's say if I am assessing a database activity monitoring such as Imperva. So first is I am going to examine how this control works. I am going to review their low level design, high level design document. I am going to review their architectural document, all these security control assessment document I am going to review. Now, when I say interview, the team who is responsible, the team or an individual subject matter expert who is responsible, who has implemented this tool, I am going to interview that candidate. I'm going to have a one-on-one session or take an interview of that candidate to check like how the controls has been implemented. Has the organization followed proper configuration management, change management, and the way the control is implemented, is it suiting my business and legal and regulatory requirements? Okay, now once I have conducted the examine and interview, the third step is the testing of the controls. So live example over here. So let's say I have implemented a database activity monitoring for monitoring a SQL and Oracle database. But how do I validate that the control which we have implemented, it is effectively working or not? I am going to test the control. So I am going to randomly connect to any database, run a select, update, insert, delete statements, and check that whether these statements which I executed, whether it is being reported on the dashboard, whether it is reported as a policy violation. So that is the test. So in the real world, we are going to use all the three mechanisms: examine, interview, and test. Then finally, we are going to determine the security control assessment planning and execution. So how frequently we are going to conduct a control assessment? Okay, how we are going to execute? So like what would be the frequency of conducting a vulnerability assessment? Normally in every organization, you must have seen, when we talk about a vulnerability assessment is something which is conducted every month, on month basis, right? But we don't conduct the pen testing that frequently, right? Pen testing only happens once in a year, right? So we are going to determine the security control assessment mechanisms. So how frequently we are going to conduct the assessment, how frequently we are going to conduct the privacy assessment, finally manage the findings, whatever findings during the control assessment we have identified, manage it, check for the deficiencies, and based on that develop the plan of action and mitigation. And finally conduct whatever assessment you are doing, compare the self assessment versus independent assessment. So what do you mean by self assessment? What do you mean by the self assessment and independent assessment? The basic difference is self assessment is something which is conducted by the internal team, whereas independent assessment is something which is conducted by a third party auditor. right? So in a nutshell, I can say, like, when we talk about from an ISO 27001 perspective, in ISO 27001, every year we basically conduct something called as a surveillance audit, right? So that is a live example of independent assessment versus self assessment to identify like what are the gaps which we have identified. So now if we are talking about from the ISC square exam outline in the domain 5. So in this, we are first going to prepare for the assessment and audit, where we are going to identify what are the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders. We are going to determine the objectives and scope. Why objective and scope is needs to be determined? Because not everything can be tested. Because when we are conducting an assessment and audit, we have a limited time period. Within that time, we have to complete the assessment. So we will define the objectives, we will define the scope of the system which we are going to test, what are the resources which we need, when exactly we are going to conduct the assessment, how it is going to meet our deliverables, and any kind of logistics which is needed, we are going to outline it. Finally, we are going to identify the assets, the methods of conducting the assessment, and what is the level of effort which is required. And finally, we are going to ask for demonstration of compliance. So before we conduct, so live example of this, normally you must have seen that in the ISO 27001, when we conduct a surveillance audit and all, normally when the auditors come to conduct surveillance audit, they always, what is the first thing which they ask? They ask the previous year assessment or audit reports. So that is this, because they are going to identify that whatever gaps we have identified during the previous year, whether those gaps are still there in the system or whether those are mitigated. If the gaps are still there, does the organization has a proper reason for not taking any action on those gaps? So in the evidence of demonstration of compliance audited, we are going to ask for the previous assessment, audit, system documentation, etc. And finally, the audit plan will be finalized. Based on the audit plan, we will conduct an assessment. So where we will check for the compliance capabilities, verify the appropriate assessment method. So like our policy says that all the user accounts, all the privileged user accounts, or let's say our policy says like all user account must have a 16 character password, 16 character alphanumeric password. But is all user account is having 16 character password or not? Go check and verify. So we are going to use the method interview, examine, test, which we have discussed previously. Now whatever vulnerabilities during the vulnerability assessment scanning, whatever vulnerabilities we have identified, how we are going to check that what is the exposure factor, or what would be the impact if those vulnerabilities are exploited. For that, we are going to conduct the penetration testing. And finally, the evidence will be verified and validated. Based on this, we are going to prepare an initial assessment and audit report, where we will identify what are the risks which we have identified during the assessment. We will basically, what are the risk mitigation summaries which are outlined, and what is the preliminary findings which was being recorded. Based on the initial assessment and audit report, we will basically determine what level of action we need to take in whatever risks we have identified. Do we need to avoid it? Do we need to accept it? Do we need to share it, mitigate it, or transfer it? If the organization says that we are going to accept that risk, so we have to make sure that we properly document that decision. Okay. And if there are any non-compliant findings which we have discovered, we have to make sure that the corrective actions are taken. And once the corrective actions is taken, we are going to reassess it and validate if those gaps has been closed. Finally, we are going to develop a final assessment and audit report, where we are going to identify what is compliant, what is not compliant, and what is not applicable. Okay, so like live example, if I can give you, developing a final assessment or audit report. So what is compliant and what is not compliant? But let's say if you are doing a assessment for a cloud vendor, right? So you cannot validate like what are the physical controls the cloud provider has implemented, right? If you are doing an assessment or audit for a cloud provider, you cannot identify like what kind of physical controls they have implemented unless and until you physically visit. So in those cases, we will identify what are the controls which are not applicable, because we are conducting a surveillance audit. We are not visiting the site, we are doing remote audit. So in that case, those kind of controls testing will not be applicable. Then we will provide the recommendations documented when appropriate, and finally an assessment report will be finalized. Based on that, we will develop the risk response plan, where we will identify what are the residual risks and deficiencies which are identified. We are going to prioritize the risk, and we will going to identify what are the resources which are required in terms of financial, people and technical, and what is the timeline required for the organization to implement the mitigation plan, or what is the timeline they are targeting to mitigate the risk. So these are the things in detail which we have in domain 5. So the next is we have a domain 6, which is your assessment and audit of security and privacy control. So here, so in the previous stage, we finalized the assessment. So we identified what kind of assessment we are going to conduct. Now here, once the assessment results has been once the assessment results are arrived, now we are going to go in the authorization stage, where we are going to transition the system to the production environment. So once the assessment report has been received, the authorizing official, information system security officer or system owner, they have reviewed the report. They are going to provide the accreditation to implement this system in the production environment. So live example, let's say I am planning to implement a database activity monitoring within my organization. I have conducted the POC, proof of concept. Okay, now we are in the process of implementation stage. So are we going to directly implement this system in the production environment? No, we are going to first implement this system in the non-prod environment, conduct all kind of use case testing, misuse case testing. We are going to conduct a security assessment, right? And once we have identified that the system is working perfectly, it's not adding any new issues within our existing environment, we are going to provide that assessment report to the authorizing official, information system security officer or system owner, who will review that report and provide us the confirmation that we can implement this system in the production environment. So that is what happens in the domain 6, which is the assessment and audit of security and privacy control. So finally, once the AO gives a heads up, AO or a system owner gives the heads up, which means whatever residual risk has been identified, the AO or system owner have accepted the risk, they have communicated the risk to the stakeholders. Now we are going to prepare and review the security authorization package so that it can be implemented within the production environment. So now if you go into the exam outline, what exactly we are going to cover over here. So finally, we are going to review and submit the security and privacy document, where we are going to provide the documentation which is required to support a compliance decision by the appropriate party. It could be your AO, it could be your third party assessment organization agency. Now, once the report is given, we are going to determine the system risk posture. So whether the system can be implemented, what is the risk acceptance criteria, what is the residual risk which has been identified, is the residual risk is below the risk appetite level. Now one live example I can give you. So let's say if I am talking about a database activity monitoring tool such as IBM Security Guardian, Imperva, TrustLogix, except TrustLogix, both of the, let's say if I am planning to have TrustLogix as a database activity monitoring tool. Now, what is the problem with the TrustLogix? Because TrustLogix supports the native auditing tool. So native auditing means, so let's say if we have a privileged user, like we have a DBA who is running DML and DDL commands within the database, even the audit table, the same database is going to contain the audit records of that activity. This is what difference between the other two products which I talked about comparative to TrustLogix. So what it means is that if we don't do the proper filterization, the database server can become full and it can lead to a single point of failure. So that is my residual risk. Is it acceptable for the organization? right? Going for a native auditing solution. Finally, we are going to communicate to the stakeholders. If this happens, how can we treat the risk? Are we going to increase the disk space? Are we going to fine tune the logging more? Or are we going to, store the logs in an S3 bucket or into the cloud? So we are going to treat the risk, and based on that, we will identify that if the residual risk falls below the appetite level of the organization, we will finally document it. So document the system compliance or formal notification of compliance decision. And finally, formal notification is shared with the stakeholders that now we are in the stage of implementing this system into the production environment. So at this stage, you can say the system is ready to be implemented in the production environment. Now, the last domain which we have in the CGRC is your continuous monitoring and ongoing authorization. So now, what do you mean by? Now, I've seen like many people, they get very easily confused between what is an ongoing authorization and all, right? So ongoing authorization, I will give you a simple example which will help you to understand. Let's say most of you people who are part of this webinar, you must be having some certifications like CISSP, CISA, CSM, etc. Right? So whatever, once you give the examination, and once ISC Square or ISACA, they have rewarded you with the certificate, is it permanent? The answer is no. It is only valid for 3 years, which means that every 3 years you have to keep on renewing your certification by paying the annual maintenance fees, by collecting the CP points. So that is a live example of an ongoing authorization. So even a system which is implemented in the production environment, when we say a system is accredited, right? It is not, you have to identify that whether the system is fully accredited or whether the system is partially accredited. If the system is partially accredited, which means that you have to maintain the compliance and manage the change over time, which means you are monitoring the control, that whatever controls you have implemented, whether it is effective or not. So you need to conduct regular assessments of the security and privacy controls. So live example, let's say if I have used TrustLogix as a database activity monitoring tool which can be implemented within my organization for both on-prem and cloud, I have to conduct regular assessment by running select, update, insert, delete commands to check that whether my database activity monitoring tool is able to catch and report this as a policy violation. How am I going to handle issues all of a sudden if one of the database servers stops responding or stops sending traffic to my dam? How am I going to identify and make sure that it starts getting monitoring? So I need to make sure that if an asset, if a log source stops sending data to my dam or to my SIM, I must have a way of getting notification that this particular asset or this particular log source has not sent data for the last 24 hours or 48 hours. So we are going to determine ongoing assessment of security and privacy controls. We are going to conduct regular assessments. Any kind of changes which needs to happen on the database level, like the database is getting converted into a rack, okay, the database hardware is getting changed, okay, you are going to upgrade the version of the dam from like a 11.5 to version 12. How we are going to do the change management, what would be the impact which it is going to have on the assets on the database server? So that will come under the change management and impact analysis. Finally, whatever configurations we are doing within the database server, it should be managed, which means we must have a configuration management plan. So any changes which is happening within the system, whether we are talking about changes happening in the configuration level, changes happening in the file system level, or changes happening within a port level, everything needs to be documented. We need to have a continuous risk analysis and vulnerability management process in place. So when we are saying vulnerability management, here when we are talking about vulnerability management, scanning the database server, scanning the log sources for vulnerabilities is not enough. We have to also scan the appliances. So let's say live example, if you have a SIM solution like IBM Security QRadar, or you have a Splunk, or you have a ArcSight, you need to discover the vulnerabilities which are there in this black box as well. So whatever vulnerability assessment tools you are using like Nessus, Qualys Guard, they should be able to scan the monitoring tools as well, right? And they should be able to report the vulnerabilities which are discovered within the monitoring tools, because from these monitoring tools also the vulnerability can be exploited. And finally, we need to report and update the authorization documentation. So any changes which we have identified, we need to update the documentation. So now in the domain 7, what all things is there? The first is we have a perform system change management. So now when we are talking about the system change management, changes which weigh the impact to the organizational risk, operations and or compliance requirements, revisions to the baselines. Then proposed changes documented and approve, whether the proposed changed are documented and whether it is approved by the authorizing person, such as your change control board, then your change advisory board, etc. Finally, when you are planning to deploy the changes in the form of a patch or in the form of a configuration changes, have you tested that change in the non-prod environment, in the development environment, and whatever changes you are planning to implement, does that have a rollback plan? So do you have a rollback plan? So now one live example I can give you of this, like if anyone in this batch have worked on SIM like IBM QRadar, do anyone has experience into IBM QRadar or Splunk? So one live example I can give you of the rollback when we are talking about patching the monitoring applications like IBM QRadar, Splunk, or IBM ArcSight, or let's say IBM Security Guardian. Whenever you are installing any patch, unfortunately the patches which you install within this monitoring application, if that patches, after installing that patches, if there is any issue happens within that environment, there is no option to roll back. It means once you have installed the patches in these appliances, whether it is IBM QRadar, whether it is IBM Security Guardian, or for that matter, even if it is Splunk, the only option, there is no option to roll back. The only option which you have is to rebuild the entire system. So when you are having such kind of applications where the option of rollback is not available, in that case, you have to do enough regression testing to make sure that the changes which you are introducing in the form of patch, it is not going to add any additional issues within my assets. So changes to the system needs to be tracked and compliance needs to be enforced. Now, when we are talking about performing an ongoing compliance activities based on requirement, so determine the frequency which we are going to use for achieving ongoing compliance activities, review how we are going to conduct the compliance activity, how we are going to review this with stakeholders, identify the system and assets. So the assets can be your physical, logical, it can be people. So whether it can be within the on-prem, it can be within the cloud. So do you have the visibility, like what are the kind of assets? Because you can't protect an asset unless you know the whereabouts of your asset, whether your asset is there within the on-prem or cloud. Make sure that you have a proper incident response process and contingency activities performed. How equally it is important to have an incident response process, it is equally important to track the SLA, right? To track the SLA, like define the KPI and KRI for the incident as much as possible. This is the stage, the incident response stage, where as much as possible you should automate. So how you are going to automate here, what how you are going to automate? So use solutions such as your SOAR, security orchestration automated response. So we have tools like IBM Resilient, which is a SOAR tool provided by IBM. Then we have Splunk SOAR. So develop the dynamic playbooks which can be used for mitigating incidents such as ransomware, phishing, then asset stolen. Make sure that within your dynamic playbook you have a workflow, which, so if there is tomorrow, if there is a new SOC analysis joins, and they don't know anything about SOAR and all, at least they can refer the workflow and they can know what steps needs to be what steps needs to take, what are the steps which we need to take to mitigate the incident, right? So you need to define, you need to have a strong incident response and contingency activities performed. Finally, check for the security updates performed and risks remediated and tracked. So check for the latest patches which are available. Deploy the patches on the non-prod. Okay, do the patch installation on the stages. Don't go ahead and install all the patches at once. Okay, so let's say if you in your organization, if you have defined the system in multiple tiers, like you have a tier 4, tier 3, tier 2, tier 1. So rather than installing the patches on all the systems, first patch the tier 4 systems, then patch the tier 3. Between tier 4 and tier 3 systems, there should be minimum 15 days of gap, so that you can check that whatever patches you have installed, security updates has installed, it has not added any new issues. Okay, any existing any vulnerabilities which was previously fixed, make sure that those vulnerabilities has not been reintroduced in the system after you have installed the patch. So these are the risks which you need to remediate and track. Finally, you need to collect enough evidence of that you have performed enough testing, maintain a thorough documentation, define SLA, third party contracts, policies, procedures, and finally communicate all this to the stakeholders when applicable. Make sure that you are conducting security training and awareness program across throughout the organization, and in your security awareness program you should also encounter what are the recent incidents which has taken and what kind of security practices you can incorporate to prevent this incident from happening. So let's say keep a track, like let's say if there is a phishing incident happened within your organization in the last 6 months or last year, how you can prevent such kind of incidents from happening. Incorporate the lessons learned in the security training and awareness program. So the security training and awareness program should also be continuously updated, right? And finally, revise the monitoring strategies based on update legal, regulatory, supplier security and privacy requirements. So these are the things which are there on the 7.2. Now when we talk about in the 7.3, which is engaging the audit activities based on compliance requirements, so identify the testing and how frequently you are going to perform the vulnerability scan. Conduct the interviews. So when we say personal interviews, now you might be wondering why we need to conduct the interview here itself when we have already conducted the interview in the step 6. Well, this is where the difference is. So let's take a live example that in your organization you opened a change request. Now the change request got approved, the patch has been implemented within the system, but now what happened? So you have implemented the patch, you have documented the patch, but you have not closed that change. So you must have seen in the organization, there will be, if you go to the ServiceNow or your BMC Remedy dashboard, there will be changes which will be in progress state, or it will be in progress, or it will be in pending for approval, and that will be sitting like that. So when we are talking about conducting the personal interviews, here you have to also check that when a change ticket is open, once the approval is gathered, people are notified, change is implemented, it is documented, whether the change management, whether the people are properly closing the change ticket or not. So it should not happen that the change tickets are pending, the last 6 months change tickets are pending. So these kind of things should not happen. So maintain the personal interviews conduct the personal interviews, observe their behavior. Finally, whatever evidence you have identified, document, review and update. And finally, once the system is no longer needed, okay, once the system is no longer needed, identify the requirements for system decommissioning and review it with the stakeholders. Make sure that the system is removed from operations and it is decommissioned. And finally, once the system is removed and decommissioned, maintain a proper documentation of that and share it with the stakeholders. So this is what your entire CGRC exam outline is. As I have mentioned, the entire examination is going to be tested based on your NIST SP 800-37. So if you ask me what are the, let's say, what should be the sequence of materials which we should refer in order to prepare for this exam. So let me create it for you. So the first thing is you have to refer the NIST CSF framework 2.0. This is the first document which you have to refer. Okay, this is like, it is a must which you have to refer. The second, make sure that you refer the ISO 27001 Annexure A checklist. So that 93 controls, the 93 controls which are there in the Annexure A, you have to review that. This is the second. The third one is your NIST SP 800-37. Okay, the fourth document is your NIST SP 800-53, and there is also NIST SP 800-90. These are the NIST documents which you have to refer compulsory before you go ahead and book for the exam. Okay, once you have finished all these, then you can finally refer one last book, which is the Mango Guide. This is something which you can refer 1 week before the exam. Now, if you ask me, do we have any kind of practice questions for the CGRC? Yes, there are some practice questions. We have a set of practice questions which we provide. But if you are comparing this with CISSP and CCSP, where the volume of questions, like you can practice questions in the LearnZ app, in the Boson, that kind of large question banks is not available. So you will basically, the only way by which you can clear the examination is unless and until you know by heart all these frameworks, you know what is there in each stages, you will not be able to clear the examination. So you need to have at least an overview of the CSF framework 837, 53 and 90. That is compulsory. Okay. So, and plus there are some practice questions which are available in Udemy and all. You can practice that, but all these questions are never going to, compensate what you are going to get in the real exam. Now, one more thing which I would like to tell you is, like, out of 125 questions, I guess around 15 to 20 questions are going to come for research and development. Okay, around 10 to 15 questions are going to come for research and development, for which you are not going to get any scoring. So how can you validate that the question which is coming, whether it is coming from, how to say, whether it is from the CGRC or whether it is research and development, if you get an out of the box question, okay, if you get an out of the box question, then understand that that's a research and development, so don't spend more time on that. So you have enough time. So it's not a CAT based exam. There are hardly 125 questions and you have 3 hours. So trust me, you have ample amount of time to solve all the questions. Okay, now before you even ask, what should be the ideal preparation time if anyone targeting for this exam, which is your CGRC? So ideally, I can say 2 months is more than enough for you to prepare for this exam. So if you are planning to give this exam, to keep a timeline of 2 months, that within 2 months I have to review all this and I have to go and clear the exam. Because the more time you are taking, it's going to become more difficult. Plus, when the knowledge is fresh, that time when you give the exam, the chances of you clearing the examination becomes more, right, comparative to if you take same time, like if you are taking 6 months to 7 months preparing for the exam. So now who can be the target audience for this? So as I mentioned, so the target audience can be cybersecurity auditor, cybersecurity compliance officer, GRC architect, GRC manager, If you are working as a risk and compliance project manager, analysis, third party risk, enterprise risk manager, GRC analysis, GRC director, then this certification is for you. But once again, you minimum require the 2 years of work experience across any of the two domains out of 7 which is testable in the exam. Now you have to also understand one part, that when you are defining roles and responsibilities letter, in the roles and responsibilities letter, when you are getting it from your organization, you can provide a soft copy. No need to provide hard copy of that. You can also provide the roles and responsibilities letter in the form of an email. But whatever you are mentioning in the roles and responsibilities, it should be aligned with what is there in the CGRC exam outline. Okay, otherwise they will not consider it. This is also like I'm giving you an heads up. Okay, now we have some sample questions, so try to solve this, team. Okay, so an organization is moving critical workloads to a public cloud. Which of the following is the best first step to manage associated risk? Implement technical controls like encryption and MFA, conduct a risk assessment considering cloud specific threats, update the incident response plan, and train users on cloud security awareness. So because the question is asking about which of the following is the first step to manage the associated risk, the answer is conduct a risk assessment considering cloud specific threats. So before you implement, before you update, before you train, first is you will conduct a risk assessment, right? Now, the second question, which framework primarily focuses on continuous monitoring of risk and control effectiveness? Definitely C and D is not an answer. So now we are left with A and B. Since the question is talking about continuous monitoring of risk and control effectiveness, keyword is effectiveness, I am going with the answer B, which is NIST SP 800-137. The third one, which of the following is the primary purpose of risk appetite in a GRC program? Define the acceptable risk levels which are aligned with the business objectives. Set the maximum financial loss an organization can tolerate. Ensure the compliance with the ISO 27005, or determine the insurance coverage requirement. The primary purpose of a risk appetite in a GRC program is to define an acceptable risk level which is aligned with the business objective. So answer is A. Now the last part which we have is your ISC square peace of mind offer. So many people who have already having a CISSP or people who are already CISSP or CCSP certified within this batch, they might be knowing the ISC square peace of mind offer. So in this, what you basically get is, in the ISC square peace of mind offer, you can actually sit for both the exams within 180 days. So let's say you gave the exam and you are not able to clear the exam within the first attempt. In the first attempt, the second time you can sit for free of cost. So what it means is that you must sit for both the exam within 180 days of peace of mind protection. So after the first exam, you have to wait for minimum 30 days. After the 30 days, after the 30 days waiting period, you can give your second attempt. So you can either, but make sure that both of them has to be given within that 180 days. So this is like one of the offer which you can use if you are planning to give the CGRC exam.